Hello, friends. Come on in and get signed in. And welcome to today's session of the Community Table, Vicarious Trauma, Emphasizing Trust and Connection, with our good friends and trusted presenters, Khalil Martin and Ryan Villigren. And I will turn it over to them and put you in their capable hands.
Thanks so much, Laura. Hi, folks. Thanks for being here. We're always excited to have these Wednesday sessions with y'all. I see 6 people in the audience, and sometimes people keep trickling in. So I'll just start with just a kind of a brief overview of ourselves as we let people keep coming in. So if you haven't attended one of these community tables with us, we are Heartset Training Center, and we're a fairly new and small training organization that sprung up out of former Housing First staff members, Khalil and myself. And we love to just talk about kind of relationship with the folks that we serve and the way that that is really the vehicle to the kind of healing work that we want to do in supportive housing settings. So my background is in mental health care and co-occurring disorders, as well as that housing first setting. And I've done some harm reduction work along the way. So if you've attended any of these sessions the last couple of months with us, you'll know how much we care about harm reduction and supportive housing settings in like low barrier ways. So all of that, I think, characterizes the way that we approach this content on vicarious trauma. This is the final series for us in this. This is the final mini series, like 3-part series in this larger series that we've been doing since January in partnership with the Coalition for the Homeless. So we're wrapping up here with, I think, kind of just turning towards ourselves in terms of how do we take care of ourselves and what would that look like. Yeah, so we're really excited to kind of keep plugging along. So that's a bit about me. I'll kick it over to Khalil to introduce himself.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Khalil Martin. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And I think my career background is maybe pretty similar to Ryan's. I've worked in mental health and substance use spaces. Really passionate about housing spaces and how all these things kind of intersect at some of the agencies that we work at. And because our work is so vulnerable and the folks we're working with are so vulnerable, that exposes us to some stuff sometimes. So that's something I love to talk about, something we love to talk about, and how this training came to be. So excited to talk about vicarious trauma and some other terms you've probably heard before, like compassion fatigue and burnout. Yeah, excited to be here and to wrap this series up. I also want to say this space is so big and so expansive, and Ryan and I have tried our best and still are maybe only touching the surface of what this looks like, but want to encourage further exploration around just taking care of yourself and your people in your workspaces, even beyond our 3-part vicarious trauma series.
Yeah, I'll add another small note here, which is that we are going to be talking about trauma in this session, and especially trauma as it applies to us. And part of that may bring up some stuff that maybe you've been sitting with and didn't know it sort of unconsciously, or maybe you've been pondering what it looks like to be experiencing compassion fatigue for yourself, and maybe there is some secondary traumatic stress in your life as a result of the work that you're doing. So just want to kind of offer this broad content warning around trauma and trauma-based topics. We want you to feel free to do what you need to do to take care of yourself, right? If you need to step away from the training, log off, we'll still send you the materials if that's helpful. But, take care of yourself if this starts to bring up anything for you. Okay, so offering some shared expectations, some things that we think about at the beginning of these trainings. We want your participation. We want the dialogue with you. So we're asking folks to kind of speak up. We are in webinar format. And so what speaking up looks like in this format is just accessing the chat and accessing the Q&A. We want you to feel free to kind of do that all throughout the session. Please feel free to stop us in our tracks, go back to a topic that you've been thinking about that we already talked about. We think that is a much more valuable learning experience than just kind of plodding through the material and getting to the end. We would rather engage in dialogue with you. So feel free to do that. As we're engaging in dialogue, we'll recognize that sometimes we may not agree on everything, and that is okay. We still want to hear from you. We still want to hear your perspective. And we find that that opens up a larger learning space. It brings more people into that learning space, and it's helpful overall. Sometimes we will have to move us along if we get kind of tied up in a nice conversation, and that will be only for the purpose of moving through the arc of this content. Since it's a 3-part series, we want to get to what we want to get to. So sometimes we'll push us along, and please don't feel like we're trying to skip past what you have to say, but just trying to monitor and manage the time appropriately. Lastly, we do plan, you can expect for us to send copies of the materials. That will be copies of the slides, and sometimes we have tip sheets that we'll send along. And one of the ways that you can access that will be by being here. We'll send the materials through the attendee list, but also we're going to drop a session evaluation link at the end of the session. It's a quick survey of the material and our presentation. And so we would love it if you would feel free to give us some feedback about how the session went for you. All right. Here are our learning objectives for this session today. It's a big topic, as Kahlo mentioned. We're going to cover it over 3 sessions. But for this first session, by the end of it, we want you to be able to explain the impact of empathy on the experience of vicarious trauma. Empathy and vicarious trauma are tied together at the hip. And we want to kind of explain that link a little bit. We also want you to be able to describe the relationships between stress, trauma, and vicarious traumatization, these kind of interwoven concepts that we're going to dig into a little bit more. And then lastly, we want you to be able to distinguish between the concepts of secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma, which are often confused as people are experiencing challenges in their work. As you hear academics even talk about these terms, they get mishmashed a little bit. So we want you to be able to distinguish them. And here's how we're going to get there. We are going to spend a very brief time reviewing some concepts from trauma-informed care, understanding that exploring, explicating, managing our vicarious trauma is a part of a well-seasoned and well-greased trauma-informed care model, right? We also will spend some time discussing the related concepts around vicarious trauma and teasing them apart. We'll define and discuss in more depth the actual specific concept of vicarious trauma, and then we'll spend time exploring the differences between that and secondary traumatic stress. We'll offer some key takeaways, leave some time for questions, and offer some next steps to round out our time together. All right, that is our agenda. I'm going to kick it over to Khalil to kind of cue us up for some just early discussion. We want to get you thinking about the impact of this in your life and in your work. So here we go.
Thanks, Ryan. So, Ryan already shared we are in webinar format, but we'd love to hear from you in the chat. It's important to first acknowledge that our work and what we do impacts us, right? And you're not ever in trouble for saying so. Well, you shouldn't be ever in trouble for saying so, right? So, excuse me, I want to make sure my devices aren't dying. I had to plug something in real quick. This prompt is to get our brain working and our minds thinking about how we carry these things. So if anybody has anything to offer in response to this prompt, we'd love to hear it. I'm going to read it out loud. It asks, what's something you carry with you from this work? Something a participant said, a moment that stuck, or a story that's hard to forget. One of you folks maybe experienced something that was kind of hard to shake in the workspace. Give some folks a moment to chew on that. And let us know in the chat. This specific prompt is very like participant or client specific, but there's also things we experience in our workplace that maybe sometimes have nothing to do with our participants, and those conversations and those stories are welcome as well. Joe Hamilton says, walking in for a home visit to find your client deceased on a floor. Thanks for sharing that, Joe. We do know that folks in our services do pass away, right? And sometimes we might be the only ones to know, or the first ones to know, because of our frequent contact with them. And maybe how pushed to the margin of society and social spaces they've been. And that can be a really hard thing. Recounting of a sexual assault, somebody says in the chat. I don't know if that's something you experienced specifically or if you heard a participant recount this. Both would be completely valid experiences in to call or label a trauma, and we'll talk about maybe which one that is as the training moves on. Sunshine, what a beautiful name. Said, I had a client that I was trying to help gain custody of her son, and she got cancer and died within 5 months, and it was so hard watching her health decline. Yeah, sometimes in our settings, we are tasked to face things that we didn't expect to be faced with, right? We maybe know how to get somebody their benefits. We know how to engage folks in home visits. We can maybe hype them up and engage in some motivational interviewing to, get them reaching the goals that they are saying they want to be working toward. But then sometimes these really wild things happen, like cancer, right? That we don't have any control over at all. And those aren't necessarily the things we are always prepared for or familiar with in our workspace, but do pop up and can be hard. Ryan shares about an interaction they had. The first time they were a supervisor, they had to make a decision to involuntarily hospitalize somebody. Yeah, the idea of involuntary hospitalization can certainly be traumatizing for folks. We have someone saying the same thing happened to Joe around finding a participant passed away, and lots of IV drug use. You get almost immune to seeing someone actively use needles. These are all, I think, Ryan might call them work hazards, or vicarious trauma might be just a work hazard in general, right? Things we're exposed to in our workplaces that do impact us in specific ways. Now, this isn't on the screen, but I'd love to hear what folks have maybe done for themselves or what maybe your agency supported you in doing to move through these things, through sexual assault in the workplace, through participants passing away, through big diagnoses that your clients and participants might receive. How have you moved through those? Wow, and Laura put another big one about a participant burning down an apartment building. Self and red flag to group process. Ryan, are you familiar with self or red flag? Me either. Joe, if you'd like to expand on this or give us like the quick and dirty, what these are, they sound like, I have a book called Creating Sanctuary right here on my desk. But it sounds like a specific processing tool or structure to like move through these things. And I'm glad that your agency has made space for that. Just active processing, right? Making these things feel directional. Oh, is Joe able to share? I see that they're
Hey guys, what's up?
welcome.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah. So I was previously at a nonprofit, and we went through the 4-year certification process to become trauma-informed care through the Sanctuary Institute. We're now doing that here at Louisville Metro through the Trauma Resilient Communities TRC model. So self is it's looking at safety, emotions, loss, and then the future. So it's a way when there is vicarious trauma or even collective trauma with the group, you're able to process, you're able to process your emotions, but you also end on kind of a future focused so that you don't, we don't stay stuck, right? We're moving forward. And so, and then the red flag is is a similar tool. We call it a all hands meeting. TRC calls it an all hands meeting, but it's a similar format where you can, you just group process and you're able to kind of get past collectively all the feelings and it kind of end on a positive note. So those have been really helpful.
Yeah, they sound helpful. And there's a ton of actually, I think tools and like specific like written structures for moving through disruptive events or crises in the workplace specifically. And these sound like that. And I want to actually just add one more thing to these structures is that oftentimes they're meant to get people back to work. And sometimes not always meant to make sure that people are healthy enough to return to work. I do think that anything that is based in trauma-informed care is taking that into consideration, the health of the providers and the people. And I want to believe that that is, the bones of those tools like self and red flags. But thanks so much for sharing that. I think that's awesome. And I think more of our agencies should have like written, like, here's what we do when this specific thing happens in our workplace. Or like a drop in sort of like, hey, we need some support around this specific thing. When Ryan and I worked in the housing first space, I was leading a team, a polysubstance use team. And that processing was really left up to me. And I'm not sure how great I did all the time, right? Because there are more people to serve, right? People die, and then I'm like, oh no, we've got to take this person to their appointment so that they don't die, right? It's really hard to catch your breath sometimes. I think something that maybe a lot of us in this space can relate to.
I just wanted to also add what I like about tools like the ones that Joe shared are that they're very structuring, right? And so to kind of piggyback on what Kalo was sharing as a team leader, he was tasked with like helping his team process major events, including and up to death, and having a tool that is sort of structured and can serve as a container for some of this work is super helpful. So yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing, Joe.
So yeah, and I just want to quickly, we'll move on. I'm going to read what some other folks have done that they put, but encouraging time away from work, huge one. Attending funerals for clients, engaging with your EAP. So many, I do some like crisis management stuff, and represent like a lot of EAPs through this agency that I work for part-time. And so many of the folks that I work with during these crises have no idea that they have EAP benefits, access to just free therapy for them, right? Provided by their insurance carrier at their workplace. Whether they're insured or not, that might be a benefit that you have through your agencies. Someone said lots of self-care, getting better on morning and nightly routines. Ryan also mentioned the word structure. Routine can also be super helpful for predictability. We know that our participants, if we are trying to be as trauma-informed as we can, also really benefit from predictability and not surprises. So this one makes a lot of sense. Meditations and grounding and yoga. Awesome. Some body work here, it sounds like. EAP and counseling. Yeah. I'm a little biased in that I am a therapist for, that's what pays most of my bills, but right.
Oh, I think we lost you, Kalo. You still there? Oh no! It looks like everybody else is seeing Kalo froze. Oh, there you are. You're back. Say something.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we got
That's
you.
so strange. I was really on a roll, I felt like too. So thanks for all your responses. We're gonna move on. What we're gonna do now is explore how these experiences, the ones you've named in the chat, maybe the ones that you haven't named at all, but know and hold to yourself, shape us in our work, but also in our lives outside of our workplace, right? Our work impacts our daily lives and how we engage with the world outside of our work role as well. So this training specific is meant to acknowledge your work's impact on you and figuring out how to care for ourselves while continuing to provide care for the folks that we care about in our work settings. So just really quickly, this is a brief review of trauma-informed care. And we want to drop these 5 R's here that really help us understand what trauma-informed care can look like in a nutshell. So trauma-informed care is a program that realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths of recovery, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, and responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. And then we like to add one that says repairs and acknowledges mistakes. So we can explore the idea that understanding and managing vicarious trauma is a necessary part of trauma-informed care as well. Taking care of ourselves and addressing our own needs helps us to address the needs of other people. And I think makes us better equipped as well to be addressing the needs of other folks. Some additional review is trauma-informed care has 6 key principles. So we have the 5 R's and the 6 key principles. And those 6 key principles are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, the idea of integrating peer support in the care for our folks, and maybe in the vicarious trauma setting, that looks like peer-to-peer support with you and your colleagues, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice, and choice, and then cultural, historical, and gender concerns are also going to all be really important pieces of keeping trauma-informed care in mind. Alrighty, this might be a slide that is familiar to you. We've done trauma-informed care. We've talked about trauma symptoms and what it looks like to recognize these things, right? That's going to be one of the 5 R's. And you might be really, really fantastic at identifying these symptoms and this kind of presentation in your participants and your clients and the folks that you work with. But what's it look like to kind of like turn that magnifying glass around, right? And to look at ourselves. So these are some pretty standard trauma symptoms that you might find in the DSM, right? These are some of the ways that trauma manifests. And it's also important to know that vicarious trauma can also manifest in these ways, right? So it can look like agitation and anxiety, you just generally being more irritable. It can look like some physical concerns you might have, like, are you more achy? Are you literally in pain throughout the day? Do you have other maybe chronic health conditions, that should be a word, conditions and issues together. Health issues related to stress, like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, might be another one. Feeling numb or disconnected, that sounds a lot like dissociation, right? If you feel like the first time you are in your body and in your brain is when you're leaving work, that could be a sign of trauma, right? Exhaustion or persistent fatigue, being confused, sadness, depression. These are all things that come with the trauma space. Some heavy hitters might be, I think, that are more like textbooky PTSD trauma symptoms that we're talking about. We might see at the end of this list here, the idea of like flashbacks, intensive or intrusive recollections, like memories that you can't control or don't feel in control of, insomnia, night terrors, or another sleep disorder, and flashbacks, if I didn't say that already. These are all ran into the diagnostic criteria for PTSD in some way or another, but also can be present in our own lives as we experience what we do in the workplace. So if you're reading this and you're like, wow, that's me, I want to say that that could be a trauma symptom, but also doesn't have to be, right? If you have a headache, that doesn't necessarily mean that's trauma or you are vicariously traumatized, right? So it's important to think about the context that you exist in, what's going on in your life in the given moment before you look at this and say, oh, I was confused yesterday, I must have PTSD, right? That's not what we're doing with this list, but this list is meant to help you have a more educated and informed understanding of what it looks like to recognize these symptoms, not just in your participants, but in you and maybe in your peers and colleagues or the team that you're leading. Can you recognize these in the folks that you work with and say, oh, maybe this person isn't in the best headspace to go out on that home visit, right? And then what do we do with that? Anything to add here, Ryan?
No, I think you got it. Just us trying to kind of point out the similarity that vicarious trauma has to more directly experienced trauma. And so, because we're also people, we may have our own kind of outside of work traumas, and this gets a little thorny and tangly where we're maybe survivors of a type of trauma, but also experience secondary trauma in the work that we do. And so, perhaps these symptoms can be amplified. Perhaps one version of your trauma is showing up in this way and another is not. No easy answers, no clear-cut answers, but kind of want you to recognize the similarity and how it presents.
So really what we are trying to let folks know is vicarious trauma is an additional piece to the puzzle, right? That is so necessary to be talking about and working with and holding in our support and work in healing for other people and working with and alongside other folks. We also experience trauma outside of our workplaces, right? I think Ryan was talking a little bit about that just now. And we bring that into our workspace too. There might be something that is really hard for you to work with that somebody else is really great at. For example, if we had incarcerated individuals on our team, guess what we were supposed to do? We still had to have face-to-face contact with them, right? So somebody on our team needed to go to jail, needed to go to prison to set up this appointment and have this face-to-face contact with our participants, right? But if somebody on my team is really triggered by like carceral spaces or prison or has their own experience, maybe they've been incarcerated themselves and doesn't want to do that, right? Or doesn't feel able to do that, we might need to respond or react a little differently or troubleshoot this because of what they already bring into our workspace that has nothing to do with the workspace, right? I want to, I think, add that piece too, is like we can be traumatized by our work. And I think I'm maybe not beating a dead horse. We don't say that anymore, but I am being redundant in saying you come to work with your trauma already there as well, in addition to maybe being traumatized at work. Feeding a fed horse, there we go. Ryan with the vegan. What are these? Similes, metaphors? I don't even know what they are.
It's an idiom.
An idiom. I have a master's degree, right? All right, so one of the other R's is the idea of realizing the widespread, just like pervasiveness of trauma, right? So one of the things that we know is that upwards of 80% of the general population have experienced some sort of traumatic event in their life. That means likely everybody in this space and on this webinar this afternoon, right, has experienced trauma in their life. So that includes our participants and also us in our workspace. So recognizing the signs and symptoms means, again, I'm feeding a fed horse here, but we're looking at us and our participants. But I also want to be clear that Ryan and I are not encouraging us to like avoid the traumatic experiences and stories and retellings of life histories in our workplaces. Those stories are so important, right? It's so necessary that we are plugged in and informed about the trauma histories that the folks that we're serving have and come into our spaces with. And speaking of avoidance, avoidance is actually a mental health symptom that is not super talked about, but is responsible for maintaining and sustaining so many other mental health symptoms, right? By not making contact with this really hard or like scary feeling or event or experience in my life, I'm allowing it to just sit and fester and do its thing until I feel scared again or triggered again, right? So in the vicarious trauma space, we might be talking about making contact with the space, even though it feels funky, feels gross, feels scary, and potentially unsafe, making contact with it as soon as we can. So that we're not letting it do its own thing and we are maybe in a little more control of what moving through that process looks like. Alrighty, I've talked a bunch. I think it's Ryan's turn to talk about core concepts in vicarious trauma.
Awesome. Thanks for that overview, Khalil. So here's where we kind of pick apart and dissect and further explore what vicarious trauma actually is and the processes that lead to it, right? So the first thing I want to talk about is the way that we use empathy in the work that we do in our supportive housing spaces or other spaces as helpers. So I have some prompts on the screen. Feel free to respond to any of this. Want to know kind of the role that empathy plays in the work that you do. And if you think that empathy is important, how do we do it, right? Like, what does it actually mean to engage empathy in the work that we do? So I'll give a pause for folks to think about that, respond to it in the chat, and then I'll add some more concepts here. I'm seeing Sunshine kind of talk about and piggyback on what Kalo was talking about in the chat, the way that avoidance is something that they have used a lot, and practicing mindfulness and deep breathing and meditation has been helpful in kind of working through that, leaning into where you need to lean into rather than avoid it and letting it sort of build up and tear us up from the inside. Thanks for sharing that. All right. What is empathy to you, folks? What does that actually mean? And I'll tie this in. Why are we talking about this? Such a basic concept, but curious to know what it is. How do you use it in your practice? How do you show it? Um, I'm going to go ahead and kind of offer a definition here and talk about it a little bit more. Um, Empathy is, oh, here's somebody. Showing someone you care, Tiffany says. Actively listening. Okay. So you're kind of just demonstrating to them that I care about you. And the way that we do that is by actively listening, maybe asking further questions, showing some curiosity. Um, Even more than that, I think empathy is really the ability to understand and feel what others are experiencing, right? So more than just showing people that we care, showing them that we actually know what they're feeling, right? If I say, I feel yucky today emotionally, it's one thing for you to say, "Oh, I'm so sorry that you feel yucky." It's another thing for you to kind of truly have a more in-depth understanding about what that means for me, right? How does that actually feel? I understand it, and maybe I actually feel it too, right? I can feel a feeling alongside you because I'm so connected to what you're experiencing. Here's some other folks adding in having an open ear and listening, Felicia says. Um, Sunshine says that they're a big empath, and on busy days and there are roadblocks and resources exhausted, um, they can feel from you that your empathy has been depleted. Yeah, that's kind of a big point that we're trying to make in the session today, which is that folks know when we're not able to engage our empathy, right? They can feel it emotionally. So Sunshine says they have to sometimes take a deep breath and remember the barriers and roadblocks are a part of the process. And so you get to teach how to process through those things. You get to kind of model what it looks like to move through those things. I think you're saying here, and you hold each other's hands. Yeah, there's a mutual process happening. And then Laura says, trying to see things from another person's perspective and put my own opinions aside. Yes. So again, to kind of reiterate and to dig deeper, empathy is not just hearing what people are saying, but feeling it ourselves. And I think the most empathic people that I've known, or when I've felt the best about my empathy, is when I'm actually affected personally by what someone says to me. Have you ever been in a session with somebody or been in a conversation with a client and they tell you something and your eyes start to water, you tear up? That is your empathy, right? Kind of in practice. And that's only possible if you're like really there in the moment, hearing them and truly understanding what they're saying, right? And so empathy is really crucial for relationship building, rapport building, especially during our initial engagements with people. It can allow folks to see that we're truly meeting them where they're at, right? If someone sees I'm affected by what they have told me, they know that I'm on their side, right? Okay. Why are we talking so much about empathy? So I want to lay the groundwork for how this ties into vicarious trauma. Empathy is critical to the work that we do. Perhaps you've known colleagues who maybe you're just there, like quote unquote, for the paycheck, or you're able to see that they don't tap deeply into kind of what people are sharing with them or their process. And we know that those folks are not often very successful in their work of building relationship and actually helping support healing processes or change processes or just kind of maintaining high qualities of life for their clients, right? And so I'm here saying empathic engagement is critical to the work. One of the core components of all of the work that we all do, right? And another kind of secondary concept there is that vicarious trauma is an occupational hazard. So let me tie those two things together. Vicarious trauma is a result of engaging our empathy with people, right? People are experiencing trauma or have experienced trauma when they go through this housing journey that they're on, whether they've experienced street homelessness or unstable housing and move through the housing process, right? So they have experienced trauma or continue to experience trauma. And we're showing up with our empathy, kind of understanding and actually ourselves feeling a bit of what they're experiencing, right? That is necessarily going to lead to vicarious trauma. 100% it will. So vicarious trauma is an occupational hazard of doing empathic work, helping work, right? And I'll say that it's not an isolated event, right? When we speak about vicarious trauma, we're not talking about that time that somebody shared this horror story with us and it really affected us that one time, right? We're talking about kind of the buildup of ongoing empathy while people are experiencing trauma or while they're kind of processing past trauma, right? So it's this ongoing process that builds on itself. And I also want to say it's not a pathology, right? I'm trying to kind of paint the picture here that this is a very typical response. Vicarious trauma is a very typical response to engaging high levels of empathy with folks who have experienced high levels of trauma, right? It is just going to happen. And from my perspective, I think we can manage it. I think we can do some work in ourselves to lessen the impact, but I think it's a bit unavoidable. And so that's the case that I'm making. So let me dig in a little bit more. One way that we can kind of understand vicarious trauma is through this metaphor, and it's the metaphor of the raging river. So the river in this metaphor represents the kind of daily stress that our clients live with, right? It's very difficult to be living in poverty or to be in supportive housing programs or to kind of have behavioral health challenges or substance use challenges. It adds a lot of stress to a person's life, right? So folks are trying to navigate all of these environmental demands. They're trying to meet their own needs with whatever skills they have, whatever level of baseline tenancy skills they have. Perhaps they haven't lived in many apartments on their own, right? And so that's going to be stressful. And you're going to be helping them kind of deal with that in your home visits, right? Perhaps their own parenting skills that they have, which are whatever they are, whatever level they are, their own ability to self-regulate their emotions, their ability to kind of do daily planning tasks and executive functioning, whatever level of skills folks have, they're trying to navigate their daily stressors, right? And so that is represented here by the river. But within that, we know that folks are going to experience trauma or have already experienced trauma. And so trauma here is represented by the boulders, right? And when a boulder is in a river or a big rock is in a river, it causes some choppy waters, right? It causes an otherwise smooth flowing river, an otherwise smooth flowing life to experience some upset and some challenges, right? So as people are experiencing that trauma, the river is going to sort of splash off of that and ripple to us, right? We are in that river with our clients on a day-to-day basis. We're supporting them as they try and maintain their tenancy, as they figure out what it means to reorganize their relationship with substances, to deal with interpersonal challenges. And so all of the splashes of that trauma are going to hit us when they tell us about it, when we learn about it, when we get that email that the building burned down. That is stress and what I would call secondary trauma rippling off onto us. So let me define secondary trauma for you. The natural behaviors and emotions resulting from knowledge about a traumatizing event experienced by someone significant in your life, right? It's the stress that results from helping or wanting to help somebody who is experiencing trauma or is suffering in some way. So again, it's natural. It's going to result from us knowing about it or attempting to help, right? So this is really specifically about the effects on the helper and whatever exposure they have to somebody else's trauma. And helpers can experience post-traumatic stress effects, just like post-traumatic stress disorder for the person that in question, just like participants, but usually at a lower level, right? So if a participant experiences post-traumatic stress symptoms, it's possible for us to experience post-traumatic stress symptoms as well, but usually at a lower level than the person directly experiencing that trauma. Is this all making sense for folks so far? All righty. So here I want to kind of talk a little bit about this relationship between stress and trauma, the kind of daily stress that people are in, that river. So one way of kind of understanding that relationship is that the concepts of stress and trauma might not actually be that different, right? They might not be separate concepts at all. They might be on a spectrum where an experience of stress is a state of worry, of mental tension, and it's caused by a difficult situation. But if you take that to the extreme, that's not that different from a traumatic event, right? Some event that experienced intensely that has an effect on us. Okay? So I'm trying to kind of indicate that stress and trauma are on a spectrum, and we're dealing with people's stress every single day, right? Regular daily life stress. What might make something experienced as trauma as opposed to stress, though, would be when the intensity of the experiences rise, or whether it's a high intensity of stress is experienced in a short time frame, right? An eviction is pretty stressful, but it's because it's experienced sometimes in a kind of a very short time frame, or the challenges that somebody is experiencing in dealing with their landlord and trying to pay their rent, maybe not succeeding in that, having to go to court, that occurs with increasing level of intensity, right? So it might be experienced as stress initially and eventually experienced as trauma. So there's that relationship there. Yeah, I think that's what I want to say there. And so we can take the idea of that continuum of stress to trauma and look at it through the lens of adverse childhood experiences and the ACE study, right? And if you'll remember, if you were with us in our trauma-informed care series earlier in the year, we talked about the second level here, the lower level of adverse community environments, where some of those traumatic experiences are more structural in nature. They're like less event-based, right? So these are things that are experienced over time. And when our participants come to see us, having lived a life that included poverty, included discrimination, community disruption, poor housing quality and affordability, perhaps community level violence, we're kind of sitting with folks who have experienced this pervasiveness of trauma in their lives, right? It's not always these kind of acute single events. And so we can see that when we're sitting with folks in that way, it's not always going to be a direct one-to-one. They experience a trauma, thus we experience secondary trauma. Sometimes it's much more pervasive than that. So it's important to kind of understand people's whole personal history, their childhood experiences, the generational trauma that they may be living with, and all of those effects on their lives as we explore the way things are affecting us, right? There's this kind of huge entangled relationship there. I don't know did you have anything that you would want to add here, Khalil, to this? No? Okay. Okay. So here's another concept that you might be familiar with, and that's the concept of burnout. And so while we as providers may experience our own stress and our own trauma continuum, when we're supporting people who are experiencing stress, we may also experience burnout, right? And so we might define burnout, and I'll even put compassion fatigue into the conversation here, as physical or emotional exhaustion, right? It can also be experienced as depersonalization, which is that feeling of kind of disconnection from yourself or disconnection from your surroundings, that emotional exhaustion, and a sense of reduced accomplishment. Like, is this work even doing anything? does this even mean anything? Am I even helping somebody, right? I'll add that burnout doesn't always, it is possible to experience burnout even in industries or job roles that are not directly helping other people, right? Accountants can experience burnout, right? That physical and emotional exhaustion, that reduced sense of accomplishment and depersonalization. So burnout doesn't always come from um, trauma experiences or working with other people. It can occur as we've lived or worked through stressful experiences for a certain period of time, right? So it's not just people work; it's all kinds of work. Yeah. So kind of tying it back into trauma and secondary trauma. Another type of stress that staff are going to experience is just that stress of supporting clients who are dealing with specific trauma, right? So that secondary trauma. Um, and we're going to dig into this a little bit more. But I'm just kind of trying to paint the picture here that all of these things exist on kind of a very long and intensive spectrum. So as we experience our own stress and support clients in their stress and in a parallel process, we'll begin to experience burnout and we'll sometimes experience that secondary trauma, that those splashes on us. So I want to say here that secondary trauma is often confused with vicarious trauma. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about the differences between those. But they're different concepts. That's all I'll say so far. All right, I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, but to bring it back to our metaphor, as helpers, we get splashed by the stress and the trauma of the folks that we're supporting, right? We've got our own stress and our own traumas, and we're supporting clients who are experiencing stress and trauma. And in that work, what we need to remember is that we're not just supporting one client in their raging river, right? We're often supporting multiple clients, right, through their various experiences of stress and trauma. We've got a toe in many of these rivers, right? And so that's kind of one of the differences between secondary stress and vicarious trauma, which is that I can experience secondary stress or secondary traumatic stress from working with this one client, but when I add up the secondary traumatic stress of all of these experiences, that's when we might get closer to what we might call vicarious trauma, which is a much more pervasive experience, and it's a buildup over time of all of this. Okay, so there we are. I hope I've laid a good groundwork for sort of what vicarious trauma can be, and we're going to dig in a little bit. Carlo's going to help us dig in a little bit to kind of a more clear definition of vicarious trauma and how it impacts us as people and professionals.
Yes. So just bringing it back to how we opened up is like this vicarious trauma affects your work, your professional life, your career, but also your personal life. Ryan named some other components of vicarious trauma, and these words are all used pretty interchangeably, right? The idea of stress, burnout, secondary trauma, even countertransference, what's coming up for you, right? But it's important to know that some of these do have really specific definitions, and that's, I think, one of the take homes today, specifically between vicarious trauma and secondary trauma. But while we're on the vicarious trauma train, we wanted to share this definition right here that says vicarious trauma is the transformation in the inner experience as a result of empathic engagement with a survivor, clients, and their trauma material. So just engaging with this trauma material, right? And what this can do is disrupt our own sense of self, maybe even our connections to others, and potentially even our own sense of like where my life is going, our own life meaning, right? If you've ever heard Brene Brown talk about shame, I like to think about her words when I think about vicarious trauma and specifically these like internal disruptions or these shifts in worldview, right? I can maybe call someone a bad word, feel really guilty about it, and apologize later, right? Me and my friend really work on repairing that relationship. And eventually my friend forgives me because I've done the work and I've tried to tell them I'm sorry, right? Guilt is a healthy thing. Guilt is what encouraged me to maybe apologize to my friend that I called a bad word, right? Or maybe I cursed that or something. I didn't actually do that. I think I treat my friends pretty kindly, but this is just an imaginary example. Um, what this might look like to internalize and hold in a way that's not helpful and really shameful is that I'm bad, right? Not I did something bad, but I am bad. I am that shameful thing. Um, which is a disruption to my own sense of self, right? I'm internalizing the story about myself that I just can't shake or get over, and I'm holding that. Same thing can be applied to our work context, right? Um, my client got evicted, our participant got evicted. What does this mean about me and my identity as a social worker or a helping professional or an activist who cares about, the housing world and that people deserve housing? What's it look like for me to engage with others who have a home? Am I bitter of just like everyone who lives in a house because I work with folks who don't? Right? That's kind of like an extreme example. I see an OMG yes in the chat. Love that. But vicarious traumatization is really, I think the phrase or the language I think is important for folks to hold on to is that shift in worldview. This thing happened to me, or I've been working in this space so long that I actually begin to see the world differently, right? Sometimes that looks like us internalizing some really limited beliefs about our clients, right? I might not show up to a 10 o'clock appointment tomorrow because I already know these clients don't make it on time, right? That person's going to need to use. They're not going anywhere at 10 a.m. I'm not really fostering their ability to grow or to engage in recovery or health and wellness at all, right? Because of what I've been exposed to in the workplace, right? I also like to think about it. I used to talk about this in a way where I would say vicarious trauma is like the manifestation of trauma symptoms or the things that we've talked about so far as a result of just consistent exposure to negative outcomes with the folks that we work with, right? That gets draining and hard for folks. So definitely some disruptions going on internally with ourselves, but also that might influence our connection to other people. It's important to name that we're talking about trauma, and we even had a slide about here are all the terrible ways that trauma can manifest, right? But there are also some other ways that like aren't so terrible that we'll talk about in the next slide. But those are going to be it is possible to have a neutral kind of reaction to something traumatic going on, and it's also possible to have a positive response to trauma sometimes as well. If you've ever heard the term post-traumatic growth or vicarious resilience, those might be examples of when something really big and heavy happens that leads to maybe some sort of growth or healing in somebody's life or collectively as a whole. I think we see that in a lot of like activism spaces or like major movements in the world have been a result of some really awful things happening. And then communities getting together to kind of move through something together. Anything else to add here, Ryan, before we dig into like the neutral and positive responses? Any next slide?
I think you've nailed it. I'll just say to kind of tie in the kind of slide header here, Kalo kind of mentioned like our sense of meaning as a professional, right? Like, am I even helping people? That can be disrupted, right? But the change in worldview that comes from vicarious trauma is very deep, right? It's not just about our work. It can also alter our sense of our own lives' meaning, even outside of the workspace, right? So what's the point of any of this? You might hear somebody say, or change careers because they think helping is like not actually worth it anymore, or change political preferences, as a result of stuff, right? So our sense of life's ultimate meaning, that's a really big statement, right? And so that's a pretty extreme example of vicarious trauma, but it is possible. It's an end point if we're not managing our vicarious trauma. And you'll notice that that's quite a bit different from just like having a PTSD symptom, right? A PTSD symptom is like It sucks. Maybe you get flashbacks, but it doesn't necessarily alter your worldview, right? And so here we start to see that difference between secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma.
Thanks, Brian. So now we're going to look at what some of those other responses might be to trauma. We've talked about the negative kind of reactions to trauma in our workplace, or that the results of that consistent empathetic engagement that we have to have with our folks to be doing good work. So if you look at this web, at the top, we have work-related trauma exposure, vicarious trauma, right? This can change our worldview, right? We can believe to think differently about the world, the people that we work with, or ourselves. But then it can also have these other three things going on. So we have the negative, the neutral, and positive reactions to vicarious trauma. So, sorry, I'm on the wrong slide in my notes. Vicarious trauma, I would say, is the negative reaction to trauma exposure. It includes a range of symptoms that we flashed on the screen kind of earlier in the training. Another kind of a negative outcome to exposure in our workplace might be secondary traumatic stress, but then also compassion fatigue, right? The idea of like empathy is just becoming harder for us. Ryan, I just want to, this is where we can I can talk about the differences here, right? We've done this. Have we?
You can. We're going to kind of explicate the differences between vicarious trauma and secondary trauma a little bit later, kind of close to the end. But oh, do you mean the positive versus negative differences?
I see. No, the first thing. I think
Yep.
I'm looking at things in a different order on another. It's okay. So negative responses to trauma, we have vicarious traumatization, secondary traumatic stress, which sounds like we're going to talk about and make a distinction a little bit later, and compassion fatigue. Just it gets hard to be nice and kind sometimes, right? And sometimes that is a skill, and we really take it for granted, right? The idea of like being empathetic doesn't come naturally to all folks, but might come naturally to folks in this space, right? Who like want to help, want to heal, and find your way to these housing agencies, right? It's also possible to have a neutral reaction where our bodies and our brains and our hearts know what to do already. That's actually how I frame it to clients in my therapy space when they experience a really big and sudden tragic thing. So we actually don't have to jump to labeling it a trauma on the front end, right? We can talk about a specific diagnosis or like PTSD after some time. For PTSD, that's going to be, I think, a month or 2 months. I don't know right now, off the top of my head, but one of those 30 days or 60 days. If these are prolonged, we talk about some diagnostic stuff, right? But before that, we want to give your body and your brain and your heart the chance to do what it knows how to do already. Your body knows how to move through trauma, and might already be equipped to do that. And that's where we find these neutral and positive responses, right? We could have no reaction and be okay. But I'd also argue that having no reaction to something big and scary happening is probably a sign of some of those negative things that we see there on the end, is possibly burnout or compassion fatigue. We should feel something when these big and significant things are happening to the folks that we work with. But then the positive outcomes, vicarious resilience, vicarious transformation, and compassion satisfaction might be some other additional outcomes that generally came from a really low moment, something really hard, but the outcome is actually pretty good. There is some growth, there is some healing that is happening on the other end of that. So just some quick and dirty definitions. Vicarious resilience and vicarious transformation are newer things to be hearing about. You might have heard about post-traumatic growth before, right? But the idea of vicarious resilience and vicarious transformation are a little newer to be hearing and talking about. And what this might look like is folks, maybe us working in this space, drawing inspiration from a participant's resilience and working through something, right? In my own life and career as a therapist, I have so many like gems that I've written down or I've kept in my back pocket that my clients have shared with me about how they're moving through something really hard. And I'm like, That's actually really cool, right? So while I am supporting my clients through like their grief, their trauma, and things like that, I am also learning and growing from them and the things that they're experiencing and telling me about their hard lives and about the difficulties that they're having. So that might strengthen my own mental and emotional fortitude, right? I am benefiting from hearing these stories about my clients and I'm feeling more encouraged. Can we see how that's a different reaction to maybe the same thing, right? My client's sharing a hard thing. I can be sad and I can be vicariously traumatized. There's also an opportunity for me to be inspired by them moving through that hard thing, right? Which might look like vicarious resilience or vicarious transformation. And then compassion satisfaction reflects the sense of meaning that is gained from working in the field that we do. When we work through something hard successfully, right? There's something really cool that happens there. When you house somebody that you've been trying to house for years, when somebody finally makes an appointment they haven't made, when someone finally goes and gets their wound care appointment finished and wrapped up, right? These things feel really good and can protect against the negative effects of trauma exposure, right? We are exposed to so many kind of negative outcomes in the workspace that can feel really big. I think our brains have like a natural negativity filter, and it makes sense that when you're reviewing your day, that you're pinging all the things that were just bad, right? And sometimes in the field that we work in, those small wins are really significant. And I think I'm actually recommending that we are noting those small wins in our workspace because they are still wins, right? Little progress is still progress. I feel like I sound like a coach or something when I say that, but it is, especially in the lives of our folks. So we need to take those wins, especially when we work in a field where there's so much chaos and hurt and harm going on. Anything to add here, Ryan, about the vicarious trauma model?
I want to highlight Sunshine's comment in the chat that says, yes, compassion fatigue. I've been feeling this recently a little bit. I just had a convo with my boss, right? And so kind of looking at this model that we have on the screen, Sunshine is experiencing one of the spectrum of responses related to the work that Sunshine is doing, right? And potentially what Sunshine is noticing is like a negative response to some of the work. You're starting to notice like some tiredness, some burnout around being able to kind of show up compassionately for your folks. And it sounds like it might be pretty early in that process for you. It could be possible that conversation with your boss leads to some, additional work that you do to kind of manage that. And perhaps you arrive at an endpoint of like a neutral response. It came up for you, you managed it, you're kind of back to where you were. But it's also possible that you experience some growth. Maybe there's some specific traumas that your folks are experiencing that has kind of been weighing heavily on you. You reflect on the work that you've been doing and you walk away, 3 months or 6 months from now or a year from now and say, you know what, I love this work and I'm so happy to be doing it because the folks that I serve are so resilient and I've been able to see this. And it adds meaning to your life, right? And so in that sense, it's possible to kind of move through this whole spectrum of responses, right? Where maybe it starts off somewhat negative, you manage it, and you look back and have experienced some vicarious resilience, right? And are so proud of the work that you do. I think that would be like an ideal situation. It doesn't always happen that way for us, and it's not always linear in that way for us. But just kind of want to point out the way that what you're describing fits into this vicarious trauma model. Okay. Yep. Thanks, Sunshine, for sharing that. Okay. So want to kind of hone in now and target like this difference between secondary traumatic stress or secondary traumatization is another way to say that, and vicarious trauma, right? So here are the differences. Here it is kind of laid out in bullet point format. On the left, we see on the left, we see secondary traumatic stress, and it includes a potentially rapid onset, right? Where similar to kind of like an acute traumatic event happening in a person's life, secondary traumatic stress can kind of happen acutely in that way. You walk into the home visit, you walk into the person's apartment, you find that they have passed away, you find them, the fallout from that, and you immediately start having nightmares, right? That night or a couple days later. can be kind of quick, right? And so that potential rapid onset of the impact of that stress. And it's usually about hearing or witnessing some specific event and the aftermath about it, right? It's a specific event. Something happened. The client burned down the whole apartment building. A specific and traumatic event, right? As we've been talking about, it can include PTSD-like symptoms. So kind of hard to tease apart whether it's our own trauma responses or a secondary trauma response, but the symptoms are somewhat similar. What do we do about it? The way that we'll manage secondary traumatic stress will be kind of typical symptom management and processing of the event, right? Here's what I experienced. I'm talking with an EAP counselor or my own therapist or my supervisor, and I'm experiencing, trouble sleeping. And so I engage in like a very specific sleep hygiene routine. Perhaps I use some medication. I take some time off. I go for like long runs to be able to like sleep better at night. That's symptom management, right? It's related to secondary traumatic stress. On the flip side of this, we see vicarious trauma. And vicarious trauma is going to develop more gradually. It's usually cumulative exposure. So not only did I get that email about the building burning down, but I also walked in and found a client dead. And I also have been processing through a sexual assault that one of my clients has experienced. It's this cumulative effect that develops over time. And it is as a result, as we've been mentioning, of our empathy. By bringing empathy to every one of those situations, over time, that's going to wear us down, right? And of course, that could fundamentally alter our worldview. And as a result, it's going to be more than just symptom management that we're going to have to bring to the table, right? It's going to require some long-term strategies for managing it. So those are kind of, in short, so the major differences between them. We are going to dig into vicarious trauma in the very specific ways that it alters our worldview in the next session. But we want to kind of start to close down this session by practicing a little bit, telling the difference between secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma. So we want you to be able to walk away with a clear understanding of that difference.
Can I just add something here, Ryan?
Yeah, go for it.
Sometimes folks, when you work with folks who have like really hard and challenging lives, it can be really easy to also make your problems small, your own real life stuff small. So I think what I want to add is I want us to remember the experience piece and like understanding trauma. Trauma to me does not mean trauma to Ryan and all around, right? Not trauma to Sunshine, not trauma to Joe, but could be, right? And sometimes that also limits our ability to engage with others in a way that is effective, whether, again, in our personal or professional lives, right? My problems aren't problems because I'm not experiencing homelessness, right? You are going to suffer negatively if you don't address your problems as problems, right? Which will impact your work. So for folks who just are the most selfless beings that we know, right, and have a really hard doing things for yourself, I like to talk about the idea of self-care and like even some symptom management and the things that Ryan is sharing as being what you can be doing for other people. If you can't chalk it up to doing it for yourself, that's what you can be doing for others, is taking care of yourself as well. The other thing, what kind of put my brain here is the idea of secondary traumatic stress. The idea that, oh, this didn't happen to me, so I shouldn't feel or have the reaction that I'm having. But again, that experience piece is going to be key here, right? Me hearing this really awful story that somebody is telling me might really impact me. I might have my own nightmares, right? I might have my own sort of symptoms starting to manifest that look like PTSD symptoms. And that doesn't mean that what I experienced, the comparison doesn't have to be there, I guess, is essentially what I'm saying, for it to be a trauma and for you to be impacted by that. Sorry to cut you off, Brian.
I love that distinction. No, you didn't cut me off at all. And I'll just even take that even further and say one way that like the change in worldview could occur could be that you eventually start saying to yourself, there is nothing that I have ever experienced or will ever experience that equals trauma. Because of all the trauma that my participants go through that is so intense, now I know what real trauma is, and I've never had it. I never will. and all my colleagues, they don't actually know what trauma is either. To me, that's like a huge cognitive shift and a change in worldview that might be representative of maybe closer even to vicarious trauma.
Yeah. I just want to share. We don't have a lot of like, here's what you do to manage in this specific section, and we will later, but I would like to share a little bit of a vignette about my own professional life. One time I was feeling really impacted by a really heavy session that I had. I have a Lebanese client who was born in Lebanon, and like his home was bombed. He couldn't get in touch with like some of his like family members. Not ever a client I expected to work with, especially here in Philadelphia. I was like, wow, what is the world, right? But I was feeling like, whoa, what do I do? I'm not equipped to talk about this in a therapy space, and don't know how I could help this person. And I was talking about it with a clinical supervisor that I had at the time, and the advice that he had given me, because you know what? Now that I'm talking about this, I might have shared this story with this group before, but that is okay. I was part of like a trivia league at the time, and it was on the same night that I had that clinical supervision session with my supervisor, and I said, this is too much. I'm not going to trivia. Right. And my supervisor looked at me and said, Khalil, like your client needs you to go to trivia, right? You need to be taking care of yourself in this way. And if it's not trivia, find something else. And yeah, so I think about that story as well, coming into like this piece right here. And that internal shift for me is like, I'm not helpful. I'm not a good therapist, or I'm not a good therapist for this client specifically, right? Because it's something that they were sharing that felt really hard for me to internalize. That is another example of vicarious trauma, not secondary traumatic stress, right? If I started having dreams and like panicky that like my own home was going to be bombed or something like that, that might look like secondary traumatic stress, right? Just a little kind of real life case vignette in my own kind of clinical life.
I feel like we just keep batting back and forth, but what you're saying makes me think of like a previous concept that we talked about, which is that if Khalil kind of heard from that supervisor, decided to go to trivia, experienced the benefit of it, and eventually started to shift into kind of really owning um, and executing this idea of my clients need me to go to trivia, like AKA my clients need me to take care of myself. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to support them. That is a positive change in worldview from the perspective of the client, and I think we could. I think we could maybe start to label that as post-traumatic growth or vicarious resilience if that shifts Khalil's worldview in that kind of more positive way. All right. Should we? Okay, let's do a little bit of work together. So I want you to get your chat fingers ready. And you can see the questions on the right. I'm going to go ahead and read out loud this case example of a person in a supportive housing setting, and kind of want your just perspective. What do you think? Is this secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma? Why do you think that? And we haven't talked again much about like interventions yet about vicarious trauma, but we'd be curious to hear your ideas there, right? So JP started a position 6 months ago as a family-based supportive housing case manager. She's recently had difficulty sleeping and anxiety about job performance. JP has been feeling more anxious recently and worries that something might happen to the children in her family if she's not constantly watching them. JP has difficulty sleeping for more than 3 hours at a time and drinks as many as 5 cups of coffee during the day to combat low energy. What might we ask JP to have a better understanding of if she's experiencing secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma? So maybe we need some more information. I think we're suggesting here. So what might you ask JP? And then what do you think? Is this secondary or vicarious trauma that we're seeing here? And why do you think that? As I'm kind of thinking about Khalil's vignette that he shared and this one, I guess I'm kind of being struck by it's not very clear cut. They have overlapping components, I think. But yeah, what give us your best shot here? What do you think? Secondary or vicarious trauma? Okay, Sunshine is saying secondary. Why do you think so, Sunshine? What are the clues there for you as opposed to vicarious trauma?
And also, feel free to agree with Sunshine or disagree with Sunshine in the chat.
Sunshine, if I had to agree with you, oh, here we go. Here's your response. Because it's more about how to manage her job tasks and balance. Okay. You're feeling like kind of the management of it is figuring out how to manage those tasks, find some balance in her life. I can see that as far as a strategy, a next step. I think another way that I'll agree with you is that the difficulty sleeping for more than 3 hours at a time, the drinking so much coffee to combat having, like, low energy, those sound like more acute trauma responses, and so I think I could make the case too that there's a secondary trauma there. The anxiety that she's experiencing, the trouble sleeping. Mhm.
Mhm. Yeah. I also, when I hear about like difficulty managing job tasks and balance, I do think of more in like that vicarious trauma and burnout space. I'm speaking specifically around like what Sunshine put in the chat. Um, for this case, is it okay if I jump in here, Ryan?
Yeah, go for it, yeah.
There's there isn't like one clear cut. It's this or that. A case can probably be made for either of these things, right? We don't know why she's not sleeping well. We don't know that she's necessarily like having nightmares or flashbacks or anything like that. But I think the key in this specific case is that she worries that something might happen to her children and her family if she's not constantly watching them, right? Which might not have been an experience that she had before and might not have been how she operated with her family previously, right? So I think this case specifically, because of that shift in worldview or internal sense of safety or safety for her family, that this might actually represent more boldly the idea of vicarious trauma for the case specifically.
Yeah, and I think I made this case less clear. I edited it to indicate that she is a family-based supportive housing case manager. So I was trying to indicate that, like, when you work with families, children are sometimes at risk of harm based on kind of what's happening in a supportive housing setting. And so maybe the children in her family are at risk too, which is not necessarily logical, but it is maybe how this vicarious trauma is expressing itself in a shift in her worldview. There was more in this case about actual harm to children, and I kind of took it out. So maybe I made it less clear than it should be. But yeah, I think there's a combination of things happening here. There is PTSD-like symptoms. There are PTSD-like symptoms here, but also we see a change in worldview. So maybe both, but maybe closer to vicarious trauma for me. All right. Here is the second case. Earlier this year, LR led an initiative at your housing agency to integrate medication-assisted treatment for substance use disorder, MOUD or MAT. And LR often provides staff training sessions on that topic and incorporates stories of people who have experienced addiction and overdose as an educational tool. So they recently began asking for last-minute coverage on their clinic days and have been increasingly delayed in closing charts. Staff have told LR that they have become uncharacteristically impatient and irritable. When staff ask whether there's anything wrong, LR brushes off their concerns, saying, "Everything is fine. My patients have it much worse than me."
We've heard that before, like 5 minutes ago, maybe.
What do we think, folks? Secondary trauma or vicarious trauma, and why? What's your case for which one that you're saying it is?
They in this case is LR, where it says they recently began asking for last minute coverage. That's LR. The person in this case began asking for last minute coverage on their clinic days. And they're more cranky, it sounds like, too. Irritable. To make this a little more simple, what do we think? Vicarious trauma or secondary trauma?
Come back, folks. You were so typey in the beginning of our training. Come back to us. Wake up.
Maybe an S or a V. Secondary vicarious trauma.
There we
V.
go.
Thanks, Sunshine.
Sunshine
V.
keeping us alive.
Yeah, I think that phrase at the end is pretty concerning, and we hear this a lot, and I hope this gives you permission to call it out or to pay attention to your friends and your colleagues when they're saying things like this, right? The shift in worldview here is that I don't experience hard stuff. And if that is the way I view the world and my own world, then I'm not going to address my own hard stuff, right? Which is going to impact the work I do for people that really need me to be my best. So I think that this is a pretty significant example of vicarious trauma.
That's so interesting. I was going to make the case for secondary trauma only because I can, and again, there's no clear answer here. I think Kalo makes a great point about if somebody really believes that they don't experience hardship in this compared to their clients, that could be a shift in the worldview. But it's unclear whether maybe that's a change in the worldview or whether maybe that person has always felt that way, right? And so in that sense, it might not be healthy, but it might not be a change in worldview. And I can also imagine myself just trying to like be avoidant, right? My other staff members are asking me, "Hey, what's going on?" And I'm, no, it's fine. They got it worse than me, right? And so I'm really brushing it off as opposed to identifying with that actual worldview. And if that's what's happening, then the way that they're calling out, the way that they're not kind of finishing up their workload, the way that they're impatient and irritable, I think that's the case that I'm making for secondary trauma in this case. Yeah. Is Sunshine kind of also calling out that it's like a self-gaslighting technique? Yeah. Like my experiences aren't valid. Other people's are. Yeah. I don't know. There's no easy answer here. What do you think, Kalo? Did I make a good case, or you're still in the vicarious trauma?
No, I think so. I think that that experience piece is important, like you're saying, and I do think these could all easily be probably
Both. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
The other thing I think about is if you're missing coverage on your like clinic days, if you're like missing work, that is like a pretty in the addiction space, you might be familiar with people saying like when it starts to like limit your life or impact your life. This is an example of something affecting somebody's life.
Totally. Yep. What do you think? Should we do one more?
What is the time? The last case I'm actually not super positive about, given.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, here's one that we even talked about. Okay, well, let me wrap us up then. Here's some key takeaways. What we tried to get across today is that vicarious trauma is an occupational hazard of empathic work. We need our empathy in order to be good workers, be good helpers. And if we're going to use that empathy, we are going to experience the effects of vicarious trauma. But that vicarious trauma also builds up over time, and it has this major impact on us in many areas of our lives. We talked about the 3 effects of vicarious trauma, right? We talked about the disconnection from our sense of self, disconnection from our relationships with others, and disconnection from our sense of life's meaning, right? The meaning of our lives and of our work, so personal and professional. We talked about the way that there are a number of kind of overlapping concepts that get kind of tangly. What are we actually talking about here? Are we talking about gaslighting? Are we talking about countertransference? Are we talking about compassion fatigue or burnout? This relationship between stress and trauma? Maybe they're not even that different from one another. And so we kind of hope that we have shared enough to help you structure your thinking about these various concepts, right? Put them in the proper buckets that they go in. And then lastly, vicarious trauma is going to alter a helper's sense of meaning making, whereas secondary trauma may present more like acute trauma responses. So that might be the difference there. And as we've kind of discovered in talking through some of these cases, it's not that clear cut, right? You may have a bunch of secondary trauma symptoms on the road toward vicarious trauma, right? And so perhaps an individual can experience both of these things on a long enough timeline. All right, that's what we have for you, folks. We do have some time for questions if you have any, so feel free to put them in the chat. But in the meantime, I'm going to kind of walk us through some very quick next steps. We would ask that folks complete the session evaluation. We would love your feedback on this session. So I've just dropped a link to the session evaluation in the chat. Shouldn't take you very long to complete that. It's pretty easy. Give us some feedback on what you thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We'll also, go ahead.
I just want to add, like, if you're like, oh, what do I do with vicarious trauma? We will have this for you in the next 2 parts. So this was like a very much, here's a really important distinction between these 2 things, right? We really want you to know that. And then what we can do is coming. That's on the radar.
Yeah, totally. Here's another thing you can do though, in the meantime, is do a little practice, a little introspection. So we're asking you to maybe take some time to reflect on the ways that either secondary traumatic experiences, could be showing up as either secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma, depending on the kind of time you've spent in the field as a helper. So just start to explore some of your own experiences and put those into a bucket of, what is that? And do I need to focus on symptom management? Do I need to explore something deeper in terms of meaning making? So we'll talk about that next session. All right, folks, that's what we have for you. Thank you so much for being here and chiming in and talking through vicarious trauma with us so far on part 1. We're meeting again in 2 weeks, right? It's going to be 2 weeks. So I believe that's May 21st for part 2 of this series, Wednesday at noon. Thanks, folks. It's great to be with you today.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.
See you all.